before Passover, over 4 or 5 weeks before Passover, there are 4 unique readings that we read in this season. So the first is Shkalim, which is coins. We're going to read about that this week. In other words, in addition to the regular parsha, we take out a second Torah scroll and we read another reading. The first one is called Shkalim, which is coins. The second one is Zachor, remember. The third is Para, the red heifer, and the fourth is HaChodesh, the new month. And what happens is that in the first one we talk about the obligation to give a half coin to the temple, because annually, in the times of the temple, annually every person would give a half coin, and they would take the money from the half coins for the money for the offerings for the entire year. In other words, every person gave a half a coin, and collectively that money funded the daily offerings and the additional offerings. So that we read the Shabbat before the first of Adar, or in this week, in this year, we read it the Shabbat of the first of Adar. Why do we read it of Adar? Because the new year for months, in other words, Nisan, the month of Passover, is considered the new year for months. In other words, for certain countings, that's the new month, that's the new year. And basically, the first of Nisan, they would already take they would collect the money throughout the month of Adar. And the first of Nisan, they would take the new coin, they would buy the new offerings from the new money that was raised for the new year. So the Mishnah says that in biblical times, the first of Adar, they would start announcing and telling everybody to pay their half coin. And over the month of Adar, they would set up shop and they would come collect. And by the time Adar was concluded, everybody gave their half coin for the temple. And that is and then they would take the money from the new coins for the offerings of the upcoming year. Since we don't have a temple and we don't have the mitzvah to give the half coin, even though there's a custom that we give the half coin to commemorate that mitzvah, we give it on Tiny Esther, the day before Purim, the fast day before Purim. It's a custom to give 3 half coins, but that's another story. The mitzvah does not apply anymore because we don't have the temple, but we do commemorate that by reading the Shabbat before the first of Adar, or the Shabbat of the first of Adar. We read about we read in the Torah, we take out a second Torah in addition to the regular parsha, and we read about the mitzvah to give a half coin, which happens to be from next week's parsha, but that's the case. Now, for the Haftarah, we don't read the Haftarah of the regular parsha, we read the Haftarah of the additional parsha. And it's called the Haftarah of the Parsha Shkalim, the Haftarah of the portion of the coins. And what is that Haftarah about? It's about a biblical story where in the times of the temple in Jerusalem, at some point, the king decided that we have to reinstitute the fixing of the temple and taking care of the temple and the upkeep of the temple. And we read about how he tries to get the priests involved in fundraising. That doesn't necessarily work. And instead, he puts up a new system where they put a box in the temple, and whoever comes to the temple would donate directly, and then they had plenty of cash to keep for the upkeep of the temple. So that is the background, and that's the story, and that's the story of why we read it in this week's parsha. Now, of course, it sounds like it's just about raising money, but the characters here are very colorful. And if we just read a few verses before the beginning of this Haftarah, there's a lot of drama. There's killings. It's a crazy story. So I'm going to pull up the Haftarah, maybe give a word or two about what happened in the background, and then we go into the story. Okay, so let's do some background here. What's happening here at this point, Israel is divided into 2 kingdoms. There's the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom, and there's the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom, there was a wicked king named Achav and his wife Izebel, relatively well known. And Elijah curses him, and Elijah says there's going to be an uprising, and you and your entire family will be killed. And that's in fact what happened. There was a king Yehu who rose up, Yehu rose up against the king of Achav in the northern kingdom and wipes out the entire family. One of the people he kills in his uprising in the northern kingdom, he happens to kill also the king of Israel, the king of Judah. The king of Judah was happened to be an ally of the king of Israel, and the king of Judah happened to be in, if I'm not mistaken, I forget which city he was in, can't remember. He was in, I think, Israel at the time. Whatever the case is, I forget. I should know this, but I forget. So this rebellion, which kills the kingdom, the king of Israel, also kills the king of Judah. What happens when the king of Judah was killed? His mother grabs his mother's name, her name was Atalia. She wants to become the king. And what she does, therefore, she goes and kills out her entire family. So she's the mother of the king. She's the mother of the slain king of Judah. She grabs the power, and then she kills out her entire family. Okay, wonderful. So she kills out everybody except one boy, because she has a relative amongst all the dead family members of the king. There was a relative who finds this little boy, a baby. So you have to hide the baby. Where are you going to hide the baby? It's a small town, Judah. How big is Judah? Where are you going to hide the baby from the king? So what they do is they hide the baby in the temple. It's not clear. It could be even in the Holy of Holies or some other hidden chamber. This baby grows up 6 years in the house of God, in the temple. The queen doesn't know about him. And at some point, when the boy is about 6 or 7 years old, probably 7 years old, the high priest or the priest of the high priest, it's not clear if he's a priest or a high priest named Yehoyada, he stages a rebellion against the queen. And when she comes to the temple, he has her killed. And now they appoint the 7-year-old boy to be the king of Judah. His name is Yehoash. And he was a relatively good king, and he was loyal to God, and he reigned for many years. So this is the drama. And when you open the Haftarah, you don't necessarily see the drama. Everything seems fine. So I'm looking at the book of Kings, chapter 2, Kings 2, chapter 11, verse 17. So the Haftarah begins, and Yehoyada enacted the covenant between the Lord and between the king and between the people, to be to the people of the Lord, and between the king and between the people. In other words, Yehoyada is the high priest that now creates the rebellion against the queen Atalyahu, who they kill, and he appoints the boy Yehoash as the king. And now he's sort of the person who, since he was the one who appointed the king, now the king is loyal to him, now the king listens, and the king is under the influence of the priest. And therefore, perhaps why this king was was a righteous king. So far, that's the story. If anybody has any questions about just what we said till now, it gets a little confusing, a few more moving parts. In any case, that's the story. So now, what happens? They come to verse 18, and all the people of the land came to the temple of the Baal and tore it down. Its altars and its images they smashed, and Matan, the priest of the Baal, they slew before the altars, and the priests set up appointees over the house of the Lord. In other words, at that time, there were many. The previous king, Atalyahu, she was an idol worshiper, and she set up idols all around town. And now the people came and destroyed the idols. 19. And he took the officers of the hundreds and the mighty warriors and the couriers and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord. So again, it's reiterating. They bring the young king down from the house of the Lord, from the temple, and they came by the way of the gate of the couriers to the king's palace, and he sat on the throne of the king. And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city quieted down. And Atalia, they had dispatched by the sword in the royal palace. Again, it reiterates what it said before. We killed the mother, and now the young boy Yehoash was the king. And the next chapter, chapter 12, Yehoash was 7 years old when he became king. And Yehoash became king in the 7th year of Yehu, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years. And His mother's name was Ziblah from Beersheba. And Jehoash did that what was proper in the eyes of the Lord all his days, and what Jehoiada the priest instructed him. So in that sense, Jehoiada was Jehoash the king was loyal to the priest and loyal to God. The only thing that they did not do, however, the high places were not removed. The people were still slaughtering sacrifices and burning incense on the high places. So the high places is called a bama. A bama was a place where they offered offerings to God. Before the temple was built, every person was allowed to make their own altar to God and offer offerings wherever they wanted to offer. Once the temple was built, the law changes, and the Torah says once the temple is built, you're only allowed to bring offerings in the temple. So the Torah is saying that despite the fact that the king was loyal to God and they destroyed the idols, and the altars of the idols, nevertheless, they still offered offerings in the Bama and the high places. Why? So that tells you that the temple was neglected. Why was the temple neglected? Because in the reign of the previous king, the queen really, Atalia, she was an idol worshiper, so she allows the temple to be neglected. So the temple was neglected. So if you wanted to offer an offering to God, you offered it in the Bama. Okay. Now the king realizes that we have to go and we have to correct the temple. We have to fix up the temple. And again, that's the parallel to this week's parsha. The parallel to the second reading is that everybody is supposed to donate a part of the money to give to the offering of the temple. So here, the priest sees that the temple is being neglected. The king says the temple is being neglected. So he says we have to come up with a plan that will once again allow for the temple to have funds. So what does he do? I'm not sure it's the best plan, but his plan is like this. His plan is when all the people, he tells the priests that when anybody comes to donate money to God, to the temple, they should bring it to the priests, and the priests will be able to fundraise from the people, and it will be the priest's responsibility to renovate the temple. In other words, it used to be people would come and give to the temple fund, and people would come and give gifts of produce to the priest. But the service of the temple, but the correcting of the temple, therefore, the maintenance of the temple was neglected because there was no one in charge. So the king says, you know what? What if the priests, they're the ones who collect all the money? They'll collect all the money. They get to keep all the money, but their responsibility would be it's their responsibility to donate to upkeep the temple. I'm not sure that's the greatest idea. You'll see it doesn't really work, but that's his plan. Verse 5. And Jehoash said to the priests, all money of the hallowed things, which is brought to the house of the Lord, the money of anyone who passes the numbering, that's actually specifically the gift we're talking about, the half shekel that they used for a census, but they also used it for the offerings. Each one, the money of the value of the people whose value he vows to donate. All money which comes upon a man's heart to bring to the house of the Lord. In other words, any form of donation that a person wants to donate, and he enumerates a few. Some are vows. In the Torah, there's a whole system. If someone says, I'm going to donate to the temple my value. So how do you value that? So these are some of the lists that he enumerates. Everything should go to the priests. The priests shall take for themselves, each one from his acquaintances, and they shall strengthen the damage of the house wherever damage is found. In other words, each priest should go to his family, to the acquaintances, and raise the money, and then they'll be able to strengthen the damage of the house. In other words, pay for the upkeep. So if you ever did a fundraising campaign, you know that it's in some sense it's easier to donate to raise money for a new building than it is for the upkeep of the old building, because the new building everyone sees it's a beautiful building, wonderful, how beautiful. But the upkeep, what are you paying for? You're paying for electricity, you're paying for sewer, you're paying for just the maintenance. It's not as exciting, and that's exactly what happens in this story. So this is 2 decades later. The king tries to find out what's going on in the temple, and he finds out that the priests are not strengthening the damages. Either they're not raising the money or they're not spending it right. There's a problem. He has to revamp. So that's going to be verse 7. So the verse continues, and it was that in the 23rd year of the king Jehoash. So it's the 23rd year of his kingdom. And the priest did not strengthen the damages of the house. And the king Jehoash summoned Jehoiada, the priest, and he said to them, in other words, that was the priest that made him the king. He summons him and he says, what's happening? Why are you not repairing the damage of the house? Now, take no money from your acquaintances, but give it for the damage of the house. Don't take any more money. You're not allowed to raise money. You're not allowed to take money for the temple anymore. Verse 9, and the priest agreed not to take money from the people and not to repair the damage of the house. In other words, they're not going to raise the money and they are not going to be the ones responsible. So what does the high priest do? What does the king do as an alternative way of raising the funds? And Jehoiada, the priest, took one chest and bored a hole in the door as he placed it near the altar on the right, where a person enters the house of the Lord. And the priests, the guards of the household, would pull all the money that was brought into the house of the Lord into there. So you have a box, and the box has a hole, easy to put the money in, but it's not easy to take the money out. And what happens is whoever comes would bring money to the temple, will put the money inside that box. And it was when they saw that there was much money in the chest, and the king's scribe and the high priest went up and packed and counted the money which was brought into the house of the Lord. So they send the scribe and the high priest to write down how much money was raised. Verse 12, and they would give the counted money into the hands of the foremen of the work who were appointed in the house of the Lord, and they spent it for the carpenters and for the builders who work in the house of the Lord, and for the masons and for the stone cutters, and to buy wood and quarried stones to repair the damage of the house of the Lord, and for everything which would be spent in the house to strengthen it. However, there would not be made for the house of the Lord silver pitchers, musical instruments, basins, trumpets, or any other golden or silver utensils from the money brought to the house of the Lord. It's saying the money was used specifically for the structure, for the temple, not for the vessels needed for the service, such as the instruments and other vessels. But they would give it to the foreman over the work, and they would repair therewith the house of the Lord. Now there's an interesting verse, verse 16, and they would not reckon with the men into whose hand they would give the money to give the foreman over the work, for they did the work honestly. In other words, if you were the contractor, they would not bill the contractor, they would not check and see. They would not ask the contractors for the exact amount that they spent because they trusted them. In other words, they would count the money from the box to see how much they're giving to each contractor, but the people doing the work, they would not count it, they were trusted. And then he says, however, the money for guilt offerings and the money for sin offerings would not be brought to the house of the Lord. They would go to the priests. The priest still did have a source of the income, other offerings and other gifts that were given to the priests. So that's the story in short. We'll talk about this in another few minutes. I just want to say that because this week's Haftarah, it also happens to be Rosh Chodesh. So therefore, we also read the first and last two verses of the Haftarah of Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, Shabbat which is Rosh Chodesh, which we'll talk about another time if Shabbat falls out to be Rosh Chodesh, so we'll leave that alone. So what's the big picture? What's really happening here? So what's happening here is that it's not just a story of how do you get money to pay for the maintenance of the temple, even though it's very important to pay the money for the maintenance of the temple. What's happening here is how do you create a scenario where the people are invested in the service of the temple, and the service of the temple, the people see it as an expression of their own connection to God. So many people believe what was the original plan of the king, and why did that fail, and what was the alternative plan? So the original plan of the king is you empower the priests to go raise money from the people they know. They can keep a percentage, and they'll be responsible to build the temple. There are many problems with that model, but a few problems. But some of the problems may be is that the priests are going to the people they know. Who would they go to? They probably go to the people with means. They're not going to the common people. It's not efficient to go to the common person who will give you a half a coin. So it turns out that they go to a few people who are powerful, who are wealthy, who gave a donation in the beginning to set up the house of the temple, to set up the temple, but to renovate the temple. But on an ongoing basis, it's hard to create that excitement. And therefore, the new model, what the new model does, first of all, it says you don't need the priests. It's not about the priests going to the people. Anyone coming to the temple can feel that they are participating by giving a certain amount. How much? There's no difference. Nobody knows. It used to be when the priests went to fundraise, so everybody knew who's giving how much. And people who gave less perhaps did not feel as invested. But once there's just a box and everybody can give directly and it's anonymously, then it's much more similar to the way we have it in this week's in the Parsha, where each person gives a coin, and where the Torah emphasizes that the wealthy person should not give more than a half a coin, and the poor person should not give less than a half a coin, because everybody has this in this form of donation. Everybody is equal. We want to emphasize that everybody has the same equal part in the relationship with Hashem. There are other forms of donations where the Torah says each person gave as much as their heart desired. But here, there was one specific, in the portion of Shkalim, in the portion that we're going to read on Shabbat, there's one specific donation where everybody must give a half a coin, no more, no less. And in that sense, it highlights that before God, it doesn't matter how much you give, everybody participates equally and everybody has an equal part. So it seems, according to some of the commentaries, that that's the function of the new system. That's the function of the box. People give directly to the temple. They feel closer, they feel invested, and it's anonymous, so nobody knows how much each person is giving. So a person doesn't say, well, my friend gave more, my friend gave less, maybe my friend is more connected, less connected. And in that sense, that reflects what the Torah is trying to achieve in our Parsha. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. A lot more to say, but under the constraints of time, I think that will be it for today. If anybody has any comments, questions, we could stay for another 2-3 minutes. Thank you for joining. Go ahead.
The poor people actually more close to God because they give more money compared to what they having.
Correct. That's God's perspective, but that's not the perspective of the rich people. It's also not the perspective of the poor people. If you come to the temple and you gave $1 and your friend gave $1 million, so you say, oh, my friend is more connected. That's why you feel. That's natural. The truth of the matter is that no, like you say that that you're at least equal, and maybe you're more valuable because you give because the poor person gives a bigger percentage. In fact, the Torah does say exactly what you say. It talks about a wealthy person would give a greater offering to God, an animal, and a poor person can't afford an animal would give a gift of grain. So the Talmud points out that specifically when it talks about the gift of grain, does it say a soul who will give a gift of grain? It doesn't say a soul who will give an animal. It says nefesh, a soul who will give a gift of grain. So the Talmud says a poor person is giving a gift of grain. This is his food. This is his soul. God considers it as if he's not writing a check. God considers it as if he's giving his essential soul. So you're right that that's the truth. The question is, does the poor person always feel that? And maybe yes, maybe no. So that's what the Torah is emphasizing, that the wealthy should not give more, in this sense, to highlight that even when they do give more, it's not because it's more valuable. It's not because that it's not that their contribution is it's not that they become closer to God because they gave a bigger check.
Right. Mm-hmm. So if they have a question for the community, they're really all equals.
Correct. In other words, every person stands before God. That's a very important message of Judaism, that before God, there's no hierarchy. At the 10 Commandments, all the Jewish people stood equally, right? So there's no, in Torah, in Judaism, when you have a priest, you don't have a priest, you have a rabbi. But the rabbi is really a teacher, not someone who stands before you and God. So everybody in the community has their contribution, and some people give a bigger contribution financial, and some people give other form of contribution. But in the essential question of who's closer to God, and is one person more invested in the relationship with God than somebody else, in that sense, everybody is equal before God.
Good to have some equality someplace.
Yeah, but you see, it's interesting how Judaism does it, that some donations in this, going back to the parsha we're going to read next week, they had to build a temple. So they say everybody can give whatever they want. If you want to give more, give more. If you want to give less, give less. Everybody give according to your heart's desire. And yet there's a separate census. There's a separate census where everybody has to give a half coin. No more, no less. So 1 second, why didn't you just do one campaign? Why do you need 2 campaigns? Because we also, in Judaism, we want equality, but we also want a place where people could contribute based on their own feeling and emotion and reflecting of what their talents are. If you have this, if you're good at this form of art, you can give that. Some people colored, color the dyes, or some people they wove the skin, they wove the materials. The point is, we want to have a balance between equality and between the ability of each person to be able to express their own feeling. And some people would feel more generous than somebody else, and that's okay. So that's why we have 2 separate campaigns, and each campaign highlights something else. One campaign highlights the individuality of people and of means, and everybody can give however much they feel like and however much their heart desires. But then we don't want people to realize, to think that becomes the foundation of the relationship to God. And therefore we have a separate campaign where we say, in this sense, everybody is the same. Even if you want to write a bigger check, we're not taking it.
Did it work?
Did it work? Well, not always. No, it's always a balance, because naturally people, when you're living in a capitalistic society, people view themselves based on their assets and how much they can give. And it's a struggle to realize that before God, we're all equal. It's a struggle. So did it work? Probably not always all the time perfectly, but we understand this is what the Torah is trying to do. This is what the Torah is trying to do. Torah is trying to do, on one hand, there are certain aspects where we're different, certain aspects where we're equal. So we don't want to just say everybody's equal and therefore it doesn't matter how much you contribute and how kind you are and how generous you are. We're not wiping out the differences, but we're saying at some point, it really doesn't matter how much you give. If you're wealthy or poor, not just physically, but also emotionally, also how much you feel. In some sense, before God, we're all equal. In some sense, we're different. Are we equal? Are we different? We're all human. Okay, so we're equal, but we're still all unique. So some systems try to highlight how we're all the same. Socialistic societies, or certainly communist societies, we're all the same. And it suppresses the individual expression of the individual person or the individual culture. And other societies try to highlight the individual, but they ignore the fact that in some sense we have a basic common humanity. In some sense, we're all the same. So Judaism is trying to balance both of those. Do we get the perfect balance? No. Do people always realize this? No. But by pushing these messages, it's allowing us to think about these themes and hopefully internalize them.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, wonderful day, everybody. And be well and be good. And we'll see you in good health, God willing, soon.
Okay.
Take care.